Well, thank you. I'm live. Great. Yeah, I want to thank you for the opportunity of putting this together. This is a fantastic experience, and I only heard great things about the Institute before coming, and they've been matched. So this is an excellent opportunity. Yes, this is. I'm collaborating with another graduate student at Duke Econ named Matthew Panhans. And some of this sort of comes out of our experience in the graduate training at Duke University. I was going to make the joke that Matt and I are the worst and second worst students of Roy Weintraub at Duke right now. Because there's only two of us. Okay.
Sort of like David and George Stiegler.
Yeah. Right. So, a little bit of background on the paper. So, we started thinking about some of these themes over the last year or so, and the HOPE conference for next spring is going to be on the transition to applied economics since the 1970s. So this was an idea that we've sort of formulated and put out there as something that we could do for that event. And that's sort of the end run goal of this year-long project. So this is sort of at an early stage, and we sort of have the opportunity to take advantage of your input and input over the next year to better develop the themes in this paper and develop some of the historical content. I think there are a number of latent, and I would say latent sort of connections and themes that will emerge out of here that will connect to some of the other papers that have appeared, but and I think it'll become more explicit as the presentation comes along. So the title here is Emulating Experiments, and I put a subtitle on here from models to methods. So what Matt and I are really trying to get at here is sort of a collection of tools or techniques in applied empirical economics. And in some sense, it's a subset of fields in applied economics, where the research design is based on this appeal to the logic and the rhetoric of experimentation. And in fact, sort of the use of what you could call a natural experiment, a quasi-experiment, the specific terminology is somewhat in flux. But the idea is to establish causal inference, and I think the causality part of that is important. The models to methods theme, I think, is something that emerges out of there. I hope that as the presentation goes along, that will become more precise, because I want to be fairly qualified on what I mean by models and methods, because that can get into a little bit of a tricky area. So in Matt and I's view, this is very much a first pass as a lot of these themes. We're hoping to sort of get some of the historical context, some of the issues, the content, the individuals and institutions implicated in this transition on the table. And then from there to sort of sort out the key historical questions and problems that arise. So let's get started. So I want to start back in 1983. And this comes from a paper that you may be familiar with. It's a paper by an economist named Ed Leamer, who's an econometrician at UCLA, and I think he's still there. I had to read this in undergrad in my econometrics course. And the paper is called Let's Take the Conn Out of Econometrics. And basically, Leamer is arguing that economists pretend that they're these white coat experimental scientists, but in actuality that they're not. And I love this quote from Leamer. He says, "The applied econometrician is like a farmer who notices that the yield is somewhat higher under trees where birds roost, and he uses this as evidence that bird droppings increase yields. But when he presents this finding at the American Ecological Association, another farmer objects he used the same data and came up with the conclusion that moderate amounts of shade increase yields. Well, then there's a bright chap in the back of the room that observes these two hypotheses are indistinguishable given the available data. And he mentions the phrase, quote, identification problem, which no one really knows what he means." And so Leamer here is sort of lampooning econometric practice. I think at the heart of it is the argument of Leamer is that econometrics as it's practiced circa 1983 fails as a science. And one of the reasons it fails is the subjectivity and the lack of robustness of econometric results. And he really keys in on the subjectivity. And he sort of ends with a plea for sensitivity analysis and things like that. So now let's fast forward here to 2010. Just to give you a sense of where we're going. In 2010, the Journal of Economic Perspectives hosted a symposium revisiting Ed Leamer's 1983 paper, soliciting contributions from a number of economists. the one I want to focus on is a contribution by Joshua Angrist and George Pischke, who argue that 30 years on, better research is taking the con out of econometrics. In fact, they even make a stronger statement and say, we've solved this problem that arose in 1983 that Ed Leamer was talking about. And the way we've solved it is through the use of these quasi-experimental or design-based methods. And they really use those interchangeably. And in some sense, these are a subset of those, but like I said, the language is in some ways in flux. But these would include natural experiments, instrumental variables, regression discontinuity, differences and differences. As I go along, I think these will become a little more precise exactly what these sorts of designs mean. The key point, though, there are two key points. One key point about these quasi-experimental methods, and this is really what Angrist and Pischke are arguing, is that these methods are already widely being applied in the fields of labor, crime, health, and education in particular. And the idea behind these research designs is that we're seeking a natural experiment where subjects are assigned into treatment control groups as if part of a lab experiment. In other words, we're still using observational data, so we're in the world of data sets that are collected by organizations and by the government. We're not in the world of the lab, we're not even in the world of field experiments, but we're looking for an institutional or policy change or some natural sort of event that acts as an intervention upon the behavior of the individuals who we have data on, and we use that to identify some effect. And I think that's sort of the basic logic of that, and I think that also hints at some of the basic appeal of this approach, which I hope will come out further. So Angrist and Pischke were less arguing, we should be doing more of this. They were doing that, but it was also a bit of a victory lap. I think they were gloating a little bit. Up until that point, I would say 5 of the previous 9 Clark Award winners were in some sense quasi-experimental people. 4 of the last 5 I would classify as people who use quasi-experimental methods. And part of that is sort of the transition to applied economics as sort of at the forefront of the economics profession itself. But I think the methods are also important to it. So some names you may be familiar with: Card, who will come up a bit later; Stephen Levitt, Freakonomics. Freakonomics encompasses a few other things, sort of the sensationalism or triviality, depending on your opinion. But at the heart of it, I think, is also the application of these tools. And so I guess I would point out that even someone like Darren Acemoglu, who's a fabulous theorist, someone who's worked on institutions and institutional development, his most cited paper is the settler mortality paper, right? Where he's using an IV of settler mortality as a way to explain institutional development, X years later. So for even someone in sort of a classically trained theorist, an economic historian, these methods are sort of a key element of their work. I think that this is also evidenced in graduate training, which I guess I could speak anecdotally about that, and the professional discourse of economists. If you go to an applied economics seminar, it's very likely to devolve into a debate over identifying restrictions and instrumental variables and things like this. But something I want to key in on is this: it's also being institutionalized in policy schools, public health schools, applied economics programs, which recruit researchers from multiple fields, from economics, from sociology, from political science. They train students in these methods, and they train these students to go into industry, and they train these students to go into policy. And I think these methods are forming part of the core curriculum for there. So back to Angrist and Pischke, what they're arguing here is that it's no longer enough, and I think this is pointing right back at what Leamer was saying, it's no longer enough to adopt the language of an orthodox simultaneous equations framework, labeling some variables endogenous, others exogenous, without offering strong institutional or empirical support for these identifying assumptions. And the key point they're making there is, since Leamer's critique, these methods that we're supporting have altered empirical practice. And I think there's 2 ways they've altered it, which will come out here. One is that it has expanded some of the boundaries of what had traditionally been considered sort of economic questions in economic science. Another sense in which it has altered empirical practice is it's changed the way economists do empirical work. And there's going to be a case study in here which I think will make that second point much more clear. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with this book. So this, I think it came out just the end of last year or this spring. So this is Angrist and Pischke again, and this is actually a book that they're intending for undergraduates in econometrics. And it's called Mastering Metrics, The Path from Cause to Effect. And then, so it's called, I titled this The Furious Five because in the book they say that there are these Furious Five methods that let you do this, the path from cause to effect. And I want to read you the blurb from the book because it's, the rhetoric is wonderful. The five most valuable econometric methods, or what the authors call the Furious Five, are illustrated through well-crafted real-world examples. Does health insurance make you healthier? Randomized experiments provide answers. Are expensive private colleges and selective public high schools better than most pedestrian institutions? Regression analysis and a regression discontinuity design reveal the surprising truth. When private banks teeter and depositors take their money and run, should central banks step in to save them? Differenceindifferences analysis of a Depression-era banking crisis offer a response. Could arresting O.J. Simpson have saved his ex-wife's life? Instrumental variables instruct law enforcement authorities in how to respond to domestic abuse. So, I love the rhetoric of it. Actually, Angrist was out at Duke about 3 months ago, and he was sort of promoting this book. So it was great to see a lot of this up front and personal. Another note I would add about Angrist's talk when he was there, he was invited by the public policy PhD students at Duke, and not the economics students, and he gave his talk in an interdisciplinary institute at Duke called the Social Science Research Institute, and the money was paid for by a group called the Triangle Health Research Organization. So this is sort of getting at so that interdisciplinarity or the expansion of these methods into new applied areas. Okay.
Who wrote that blurb?
That's a good question. It's probably the publisher. I mean, I don't want to. I don't want to indict them personally. Yeah, as these things go, it's probably the publisher. Yeah, so the objectives of the paper, as I said, it's kind of a first pass to get a lot of these issues, the institutions, the individuals, the contexts sort of on the table so that we can sort of parse and talk about these things. So more specifically what we do here is in the first part we're just going to document the growth of quasi-experimental approaches, and this is a very kind of almost naive kind of bibliometric approach to doing so. And then more qualitatively we want to examine the origins, look at some of the history here, specifically situate the credibility revolution in the Coles econometric paradigm. And the idea behind there is just to highlight lines of continuity and discontinuity in this transition and characterize the content of the transition. So this is going to be a case study from the economics of education. And then finally, we're just going to explore some significant historical context of the paradigm shift. Certainly not an exhaustive thing, certainly not a full account of the recent history, but sort of, like I said, a first pass. Just giving you the broad overview here. We'll start at the bibliometrics. The case study is sort of embedded in the examination of the sort of the Coles paradigm and the new, the quasi-experimental revolution and the conclusion. So let me start. Oh yeah, so okay. So just to sort of document that this is in fact something that's happening, what we did is we went to journals in economics and we just count the number of articles using quasi-experimental terms in either the title or the abstract. And quasi-experimental terms is something like natural experiment, difference in difference, regression discontinuity, or variations on those. And we're going to look at both top general interest journals in economics and a wide selection of economics field journals. And the idea is just to get some sense of the timing, extent, breadth of the shift. Obviously, we're going to be undercounting a lot only by looking at titles and abstracts, but the intention, at least here, is to just get a sense of what the trends look like. So here, this is the top 4 journals. I left out restud, something personal. But these are the top 4 general interest journals in economics, the AER, the QJE, JPE, and Econometrica. And you can see, I guess I would time it around 1990, and I think we'll see that in some of the more qualitative examination. A very sharp upward tick here. The absolute level is still fairly small, but on a year-to-year basis, it is a large shift, and And so we also do the search just for the word instrumental variable, and I think that parallels the same kind of transition. Looking more at so this is looking at field journals now. So I think we chose 15 or so what would be considered top field journals in economics: Journal of Labor Economics, Public Economics, Development Economics. A lot of those journals were founded in the 1970s as economics is transitioning into applied areas. And you see this same upward shift. I think it's on the order of something like a 400% growth from about here to over there. So this is a sharp upward tick. And it's something that's not just in the general interest journals, but it's something in the field journals. This is instrumental variable. I think it tells a very comparable story. And so looking at a little more disaggregated analysis, so this is looking at just the Journal of Health Economics. And then we've broken this out a little bit by the different methods. And you can see the trend emerges here. And you can see that the methods actually, there's varying levels of application of these methods. Unfortunately, this one doesn't show up difference in difference, but I don't know if you can faintly see that it's here and it's actually on top of all the rest of them. And in some sense, that makes sense. A lot of health research uses difference in difference methods, which basically allows you to control or to compare policy changes, which are often health-related policy changes across states and things like that. So it sort of matches a prior expectation in some sense. This is the Journal of Development Economics. And you can see in development economics, the randomized controlled trial, especially in just the last 5 years, has been a big deal. And then finally, the Journal of Public Economics. The Journal of Public Economics, you can see it's regression discontinuity that is used in particular. So the point of these pictures is really just to document that this is something that's happening. It's something that has a lot of breadth and it has a lot of depth. And it's a somewhat dramatic shift, I would argue. So I want to situate sort of the transition first in the Coles econometric program. I'm sure many of the people in the room are familiar with Coles. But Coles made contributions in primarily two areas. This was a research organization originally in Colorado Springs and later at Chicago, and now it's at Yale. And those two areas were general equilibrium theory and econometrics. The goal of the initial Coles-affiliated researchers was really macroeconomic planning, certainly Havelmo and Koopmans. And the idea behind that was, behind the economic planning was really what we would need to do is estimate sort of the equations governing the economy. And if we knew what those equations were, we could do sort of policy experiments using those equations, right? We could say, well, what if we raised, this variable, the interest rate this way? How would that play out through the rest of the general equilibrium process, through the rest of the economy? So these are very much simultaneous equation models where you have many equations. I mean, in the Kleinian model, right, it's like literally thousands of equations. That's probably the far out extension of it. But the idea is these fundamental equations that are governing economic behavior that allow you to do policy simulation, policy experiments. And I would emphasize that this is sort of ex-ante policy analysis. Certainly for Koopmans, who was embedded in the policymaking processes in the Netherlands, the goals for him was to be able to sort of prospectively evaluate different kinds of policies that the Dutch government was considering. So the ambitions of the Coles researchers are really well articulated by Havelmo in this famous essay called The Probability Approach. And I really like this quote. It's a little long, but I think this gives you a very concrete picture of the object or the ambitions that they have. And he says, if we should make a series of speed tests with an automobile driving on a flat, dry road, we might be able to establish a very accurate functional relationship between the pressure on the gas throttle and the corresponding maximum speed of the car, right? We could do a regression between the two. And the knowledge of this relationship might be sufficient to operate the car at a prescribed speed. But if a man did not know anything about automobiles and he wanted to understand how they work, we should not advise him to spend time and effort doing exactly that exercise. Why? Because such a relationship leaves the whole inner mechanism of the control of the car in complete mystery. And it's this inner mechanism part. And such a relation might break down at any time as soon as something changes in the system. So the idea is we could do this, but what we really want to do is this. We want to understand how a car works. I think it's illustrative here, right, that he's using an example from engineering. Very much the model in Havelmo and the Coles researchers' mind is engineering sciences and physics. That's the sort of knowledge we want to have in economics. So how are those ambitions implemented in applied economics? I want to look at a case study example from the economics of education, and this is really an example that comes out of the human capital research program. That program sort of gained steam in the late 50s, early 1960s, and there was a lot of economists, especially at the University of Chicago, who were involved in that research program. Gary Becker, Schultz, of course, but also H. Greg Lewis. So Greg Lewis was the advisor of Sherwin Rosen. Sherwin Rosen, I think, spent a number of years first at Rochester and then Princeton, and came back to Chicago in 1977 as a professor. I think this paper, and what this paper tries, the question in this paper is, well, it's two things. But I think fundamentally the question is, what is the returns to a college degree? And so this goes right at the heart of the human capital program. And what makes that question complicated, of course, is that the kinds of people who decide to go to college are not randomly selected, right? We have what you would call a selectivity bias or a selection problem. And what Willis and Rosen aim to do is to model that selection process explicitly. And by modeling that selection process, they're going to be able to uncover what would be the causal effects of the education treatment itself. There's only two equations, I promise. The first part of the model is as a model of lifetime income. And the idea here, right, is that the individual deciding whether to go to college, and J is indexing levels of schooling, and I are people. The person deciding whether or not to go to college is weighing these different alternative discounted income lifetime income streams, right? So like, this is my lifetime income if I go to college, this is my lifetime income if I don't go to college. And what's embedded into those various projections, right, are these rates of return. And these rates of return depend on things like my abilities and sort of my initial endowments. But rates of returns would be things like the interest rate or the return to skilled labor in the job market, things like that. The other element of the model then is utility maximization. So I have those discounted lifetime income streams, and now I'm going to weigh those across my preferences to arrive at some maximization, some optimal choice of those things. And so, as you can see, this is a function of the lifetime income. And I also choose on the basis of this Z. And this Z are things like my tastes, my preferences, things of that variety. So, I mean, the core element here is, right, this is a person choosing the education level that maximizes their utility. So what Rosen and Willis do is specify functional forms for these relationships. They have to do a lot of work up front in this because, so this equation turns out to be nonlinear. They have to linearize it. They have to make some assumptions about the error terms. But putting all that aside, at the end of the day, they're faced with this question. The question is, which variables in the data set that we have belong to which elements of the model, right? So the two core elements here are this Z and this X. And the data set they're using is this MBER Thorndike sample, which is a sample of World War II vets who are tracking their career decisions and their education decisions. And the question is, well, what things in our data set do we put in tastes and preferences, and what things in our data set, shift rates of return? And this is Willis and Rosen themselves talking, and they said, estimation of the selection role is possible only if vector X and Z have elements that are not in common. And this is a key point, and I think you can see it fairly simply. Note that Y comes into this equation here. So we're trying to estimate G. So if you sub the equation for Y directly into G, then everything is a function of X and Z, right? But the only way to separate the G function from the Yj function is if there's something in X that's shifting Y independently of the way Z is shifting G. So this is what today is called an identification problem. If X and Z have the same elements, as the way Rosen and Willis put it, the economic theory of school choice has no empirical content. In other words, we're in a situation where it's unidentified. We can't separately identify utility from the effect on lifetime income. So how do they navigate this impasse? This impasse? Well, they make a consciously extreme assumption. An extremely extreme assumption, certainly from my perspective. The assumption is that x and z are orthogonal, and what that means is they literally have no elements in common. We have some variables we're going to put in x and some are going to put in z, and the ones that go in x are only shifting this equation, the ones that go in z are only shifting this equation. And what they do is they say x, these are measured abilities. So in their data set they have, I think they have some sort of test score that these veterans took, and z are measured financial constraints and tastes. So the idea is that z is shifting the costs and the marginal returns, and x is shifting the marginal returns, and z is shifting the costs. And they note that this is a Beckerian distinction, going back to Becker's human capital, between factors that shift rates of return and the investment schedule, and those that shift the fund schedule. And then they say this provides a test of the theory in its strongest form. Now, I don't really want to get into the results of what they do, but I do want to, I want to double back to the Coles econometric program just to point out that this is very much embedded in that framework. You have the simultaneous equation structure, you have the model, you have the empirical specification coming directly out of a model of optimizing choice. And I think those are two key points. But we'll see that this assumption is going to play an important part later, looking at a separate paper. So let's go back to Havelmo now and the probability approach. There's this other element of Havelmo, and if you look at things like what Angrist and David Cartwright, this is the element of Havelmo and the Coles approach that they latch onto. And that element is the notion of economic causality. And it's sort of this idea of the experimental ideal. So Havelmo says what makes a piece of mathematical economics not only mathematics, but also economics is this. When we set up a system of theoretical relationships and use economic names, we have in mind some actual experiment or some design of experiment which we could at least imagine arranging in order to measure those quantities in real economic life. In other words, economic causality is operationalized even within Coles as the implementation of an experiment. And it's this experimental ideal that comes out in a very explicit way in the quasi-experimental program. So the search for identification is actually the subtitle, or I think it's the title of another Angrist paper, which is sort of a historical gloss on how they got to where they are. But something I want to point out here is, although Angrist and Pischke talk about quasi-experimental methods as very much a self-conscious program, something that has an existence, and I think it does, I'm not taking exception with that, the individual methods themselves are situated in prior histories and prior communities that were in some ways very disconnected from one another. So this is some elements of the history, and this is kind of very much a quick gloss here. But so one example is, I don't know if you're familiar with this, I'm indebted to David for pointing this out, is John Snow and the cholera outbreak in the 1850s, and statistician David Friedman has worked on this. But this is very much sort of a mythical example in the epidemiology literature and the statistical literature, where he used these maps to show that the cholera was being spread by these public wells. And so people near those wells and people with access to those wells were being affected, and people away from them were not. Another sort of prehistory here is the idea of natural experiments is much older than 1983. But I emphasize natural here because the way natural experiments otherwise show up is literally natural events. So a good example is in Friedman and Stiegler's Roofs or Ceilings essay. They argue that in some sense the earthquake in San Francisco in 1986 is a natural experiment that provides some test of an assumption or a theory that they're making. I think there's another example from the Australian gold discovery within the economics literature. Of course, Mary Morgan has done fantastic work on agricultural economics, where a lot of these concepts have been were originally formulated well before Coles in terms of instrumental variables. And Cook has a recent paper that catalogs that regression discontinuity is actually something that came out of the psychology literature and statisticians. So I just wanted to point that out. There are prehistories of these methods, and that's why I put quasi-experimental in scare quotes, because it's sort of an anachronism in some sense. The key point is that it is now sort of this self-conscious research program. I do want to highlight, though, difference in differences, and I want to highlight that through the experience of Orley Ashenfelter. Orley Ashenfelter was a Princeton-trained economist, graduated in 1970, and he initially went to work at the Department of Labor. The Department of Labor was in the Office of Evaluation, and one of the things that they were evaluating in the Office of Evaluation was the Manpower Development and Training Act. And what this act did was provide funding for job training programs, basically for people who either shift into employment or out of one job. They can enter into a job training program to gain skills, ostensibly to gain skills so that they could transition to another career or another job. And in that context, it's this policy context, it's this context of where data is available, is where sort of difference in differences emerges as a method in the economics literature. And I like Ashenfelter's telling here. I'm going to use a few more quotes from his remembrances later. The difference from the pre to the post period in earnings for the treatment group. So the treatment group is people who elect to go into a job training program, could be compared against the difference from the pre to the post period for the comparison group. So basically, we have people who go into treatment programs, we have people who don't. We can look at the before and after for the treatment people, we can look at the before and after for the non-treatment people, and we can compare the difference in before and after. That's where difference in differences comes from, the word. So this is the origin of that. That has come to dominate discussions in labor economics, and in fact is found in much of the empirical study of economics more generally. So I think it's this policy context is something I'm going to come back to later because I think it's a very key element. But going back to the case study, what does the implementation of a quasi-experimental design look like in practice? And this is very much a seminal paper in the quasi-experimental program. And Matt and I really latched onto this because in a lot of ways it's the same question as Willis and Rosen. The question is, what is the effect of education on earnings? But notice the way that Angress and Kruger asked the question is a little bit different, right? Does compulsory school attendance affect schooling and earnings? And this is literally the second line of the paper, which I love. This paper exploits an unusual natural experiment to estimate the effect of compulsory schooling laws in the United States. So to explain how this works, the experiment here rests on this institutional interaction between school entry requirements and compulsory schooling laws. So if you're not familiar in the United States, and I'm sure this is probably true in other countries as well, so school entry requirements say something like everybody born after this date has to go to school in their 5th year. Everybody born before this date does not, and vice versa. And compulsory schooling laws says that everyone, typically up to the age of 17, has to be attending school. It's illegal not to attend school. So the experiment here, right, and I think it's best to think of it sort of in the knife edge case, right? If you took two people, say the school entry requirement is January 1st. If you took someone born January 2nd and you took someone born December 31st, the idea is that those people are essentially the same people, right? The fact that one was born 2 days later is random. It's random. However, one of those individuals is compelled to go start school a year earlier. And 17 years later, they both hit the age of 17 at 2 days apart. And they can leave school at the same time. But when they both leave school at the age 17, one of them has an extra year of schooling and the other one doesn't. So if we just compare the difference in the earnings that they're going to make in the job market, we can estimate the impact of having that additional year of schooling. And the great thing about sort of the presentation of these methods is the images that they can produce. So this is just a fabulous graph. This is the years of education that individuals achieve. And this is by year and quarter of birth. So these are averages over cohorts. And what you can see, so these are people born in 1930, and people born in quarter 1 have about 12.3 years of education, quarter 2 have about 12.4, quarter 3 have 12.5, and you see quarter 4 people have about 12.6. Well, we go to people born in year 1931 and quarter 1, and we get this immediate drop, right? And this drop here is the experiment, right? People in quarter 1 are almost the same as people in quarter 4. I mean, on the knife edge, they're randomly different. But there's this difference in education level. And if we then look at the earnings of people in 4 and people in 1, we can look at what the causal effect is. And they have that picture too. So here's those same people. Now this is the log weekly earnings. And you see people with that extra year of education tend to be earning a little bit more income than people in quarter 1 who were born just in the next year. So this is a great way, selling it makes it a little cynical, but this is a great way to sell the research, right? It's very intuitive, it's very accessible, it's very transparent, and you see those words being used in the rhetoric of researchers in this program all the time. And I would include myself there. I do some work along these lines. So, I should point out that the validity of this as an experiment rests on the assumption, right, that quarter 4 people and quarter 1 people are otherwise the same. And in some sense, that's loosely speaking, that's a testable thing, right? Because we have other kinds of data. We can look and see if quarter 4 people and quarter 1 people differ in their parents' education and their income levels and things like that. So, but that's a part of it. Going back to the Willis and Rosen design, I just want to highlight the discontinuities here. So there are some key points of contrast with what was the Colesian program. First of all, the empirical specification is not derived from any economic model, right? In Willis and Rosen, this is explicit. Like, we're going to write down a model of how people choose to make their education decisions, and then we're going to take that to the data. That's not here. Really, the model is this linear regression where what the second part of this is that we have this identification strategy. And the identification here rests on the plausibility of that experiment-like intervention. In other words, I think this is the way Angrist and Kruger would phrase it, is the behavioral assumptions required for this to be a valid estimate of the returns to schooling are much weaker in this case than it is in the Willis and Rosen case. And it's important not to underemphasize that appeal, I think. And so this is them reflecting about 10 years ago. And I think this is the heart of how they solved the econometric crisis. Is we would argue this approach contrasts favorably with studies that provide detailed but abstract theoretical models followed by identification based on implausible and unexamined choices about which variables to exclude from the model and assumptions about what statistical distribution certain variables fall. So the second point's a little bit separate point, but it's almost like they're talking to Willis and Rosen, right? And I think the kind of Willis and Rosen is a great paper. I don't mean to pick on it. It's an excellent paper, but I think it's the sort of thing that Ed Leamer was latching onto in 1983. Research in that tradition. Yes, thank you. So that Angrist and Kruger 1992 paper is seminal because it sort of launches a whole subsequent number of studies. And this is a table they actually produced in that 2001 paper when they were looking back just 10 years. So they're listing here all these natural experiments that other people have done. You can see David Card comes up here a number of times, Esther Duflo, and a few others. I want to point out a few of them. I'm going to go real quick here. But one of them, this is another Angrist paper from 1999, and it's about the effect of class size on test score outcomes. And it's a very clever paper. What they're using is, so in Hebrew schools, and they're using data from Israel, there's a rule called Maimonides' rule, and I could be totally slaughtering the pronunciation of that. But the rule is that class sizes have to be less than 40. So what you get is this natural experiment when the number of students in the school just crosses a multiple of 40. The class size, the number of classes doubles, right? So you get sort of this experimental variation in how many students are assigned to each class. And that's what this picture is showing. This is the number of students in the school, and this is the average class size, right? So as that goes up, you get these big jumps. So that's a very famous one. This is another famous one that you guys might be more, I imagine most of us in the room are very familiar with this one. This is from Card. This is actually Card and Kruger looking back at their original minimum wage study from 1992. The original minimum wage study was just these two data points here, so they're looking at this. But this is a difference in differences study. This is New Jersey, which passed the minimum wage increase, and this is Pennsylvania, which did not. So their original sample was doing the pre-post comparisons between these two and estimating that passing the minimum wage was actually raising employment in New Jersey relative to Pennsylvania. So that's another good example. I like Ashenfelter here as sort of a postscript. When I first became interested in no credible, transparent evaluation of social programs, very few others shared these interests. Today it has become commonplace to see literally hundreds of studies that follow the steps many of us stumbled onto. Data collection and empirical appraisal of whether a program exists and attempted to find an exogenous treatment, which is now called, quote, evidence-based policy evaluation. Again, the rhetoric here is so fascinating to me. I do want to, going back to this table real quick, there's a couple more here that I just want to highlight. And this gets to the theme of models to methods. The expanded applications of these methods is also into areas that are increasingly disconnected from choice and optimizing frameworks. So 2 examples just off of their own sheet are the effect of heart attack surgery on health outcomes. And this is a paper that's actually published in the Journal of American Medical Association, JAMA. JAMA, and these are trained economists. Another one, this is a paper by Bill Evans, the effect of maternal smoking on birth weight. And in these applications, which are making use of these methods, the question of interest is not immediately an economic one, right? I'm not saying it's not an economic one, but it's economics in a different sense. And I think that sense is that the training and the tools of the researchers is what is identifying their work as within economics. It's sort of disconnected from these choice frameworks. You saw that a little bit in Angrist and Kruger, but I think it's more intensely true here. I do want to emphasize, though, that there are cleavages and there are exceptions to this sort of trend. And 2 that Angrist and Kruger have latched onto are, of course, industrial organization, which is still a very game theoretic and structural field where people are very much interested in merger analysis and antitrust analysis. And it's very, very close to the Coles tradition in that sense, and also macroeconomics, which is a big target for them. At the same time, I think this, if I could use the word gestalt of the profession, is in this sense. I love this quote. The modern thing is it's not identified. God, when your causality is not identified, that is the end of you. This is an interview that Marianne Fourcade did with some economists. So what are the significant historical contexts behind this shift? Matt and I don't aim to really give at least at this juncture, give a comprehensive accounting. But we do want to highlight a few of them that we think are important. One is computation and data. There's vast increases in computational power. You can literally run millions of regressions on, I could run a regression now on my phone by logging into my computer at home and telling it what to do. And that's amazing. At the same time, there's this wide availability of disaggregated panel data sets that have been collected by the government for up to 50 years now. The panel study of income dynamics is one, the national longitudinal studies. I could get on my phone, download this data, and run a regression. It's literally at your fingertips in a lot of ways. At the same time, I think there's an explanation sort of internal to economics, and that is that the quasi-experimental methods are able to be synthesized within the prevailing econometric framework and its conceptual categories. So one example is sort of endogeneity and exogeneity, but also is instrumental variables. So regression discontinuity is a kind of instrumental variable. We already have categories to deal with those. So in some sense, it's not an external revolution, but it's one internal to econometrics already. And I think that's a compelling explanation for why these methods have caught on the way they have in economics, as opposed to some fields like political science or maybe even sociology, where it's, in a lot of those cases, the causal inference, maybe revolution may not be the right word, but the causal inference transition has been viewed as something coming from other or outside those fields. So I think that there's an aspect of it there. Another one which has sort of emerged throughout here is the policy environment and the marketability of these approaches. And this is Ashenfelter again. A key reason why diff and diff was so attractive to a bureaucrat was that it was transparent, it did not require elaborate explanation, was therefore an extremely credible way to report the results of what was in fact a complicated and difficult study. It was meant, in short, not to be a method, but instead a way to display the results of a complex analysis in a transparent and credible fashion. So I think this identification with policy and credibility and transparency is key to it. This is a quote from the editors of the World Bank Economic Review, and I think this is fantastically representative of where a lot of the profession is. Our 2 main criteria in selecting papers for publication are rigorous identification and policy relevance. The 2 go together, as we cannot have credible policy recommendations without strong causal inference. There's almost an element of tautology there, right? It's like, but there we go. At the same time, we have to loop back to Lemur, right? The quasi-experimental method's growth followed a perceived sense of structural approaches failures. And Lemur's emblematic of that, but there's also this paper by Hendry, Econometrics, Alchemy, and Science, One specific example I would point to is that Robert Lalonde in 1986 published a comparison of experimental job training estimates, and by experimental I mean from experiments, with structural approaches, and the structural approaches totally failed. It certainly failed in the eyes of the profession and people involved in that. So I think that's a key element of the story too. So in closing, let me be a little provocative here and sort of latch on to some of the themes that I think emerge here. This goes back to an essay that Stiegler wrote in 1984, which I'm sure all of you are very familiar with. Stiegler, he quotes Robbins' definition of economics, and Stiegler says, does the definition not make economics the study of all purposive behavior? And Stiegler says, well, yes, obviously. And he actually uses the metaphor of missionaries. And he says that the economists are missionaries who've gone into these mission fields against hostile natives. And so the missionaries that he names are Coase and Posner in law, and Becker in sociology, Bob Fogel. I'm not sure if he names North in history. And then, of course, Buchanan and Tulloch in politics. And I think what unites these inquiries in Stiegler's mind is very much the application of a common behavioral model of purposive, or in some sense rational behavior, of human behavior. He uses some great examples from Becker. Becker argues that polygamy would increase the status of women because it would raise their reservation wage on the marriage market or something like that, because there's more demand for more women with polygamy. Yeah. This is in Stiegler quoting Gary Becker. So these were the examples in Stiegler's mind. But Stiegler was very optimistic, and in some sense he sort of prophesized that these inquiries are going to have further effects, and certainly in the area of political science and in the area of sociology. There's more work to do for the behavioral model from economics. So I want to contend that on the surface level, Stiegler's predictions do appear to be prophetic. I think economists are working in areas which in some sense could be considered sociological, could be considered political science, could be considered epidemiology, and they travel under names health economics, public economics, things like that. And it's also been institutionalized in these policy schools, applied economics programs, public health programs. But at the same time, I think there's a key contrast with the way the credibility revolution has progressed. And rather than an application of the behavioral model, economic analysis, and I put economic here in quotes just to highlight some of the ambiguity, it's increasingly the investigation of causal effects using this quasi-experimental toolkit, and not so much the behavioral model. And that's the sense in which I think this is a transition from models to methods. Like I said, I want to make sure that that's sufficiently qualified. I think that's all I've got. This is just a little summary. I just wanted to note that I think this raises some really important questions that connect with themes that have come up here. Sort of how and why economic science has evolved and changed. What does it mean to be an economist today? The influence on policymaking and economic expertise. Certainly, there's this discontinuity with the Coles tradition, but there's this intense continuity in sort of the technocratic ambitions. I think that's there. And then finally, there's all kinds of implications for economics engagement with its disciplinary neighbors. So I want to thank you guys again. I really appreciate this opportunity, and it's been fantastic. So thank you.
Thank you for this. But I've been following these developments myself and blogging about them. I learned a lot from your analysis. And then afterwards I want to talk with you about some details. But I want to ask a big picture question.
Yeah.
And you yourself called attention to the generously self-congratulatory rhetoric of the field.
Oh, yes.
And so this gives me a chance to re-ask what I take to be partly Heckman's criticism of Angricht and Pischke, but I'll retranslate him in my own vocabulary.
Yeah.
And that is, there is a kind of lowering of ambition in this field. And we can connect that to its methods, because there is a kind of status quo bias that is built into this methodology. Because if the data are not available, you don't have a theory to project from the data to
Right.
some alternative possible universe.
It's the old story of the economist under the lamplight, right?
Yeah, and the
Looking for-
so the spotlight theory now becomes the spotlight of data.
Yes, I think that's, yeah.
And the availability to draw in that artificial or otherwise interestingly motivated contrast cases. There's a slide here from technocratic to what I would really call engineering, where the thought that you could actually be modeling alternative institutions becomes extremely hard to do. Now I know in response, Angrist and Bishke say, oh, but look, we're looking at all these various cases and it'll be converging evidence and we'll do some history and this and that.
Right.
But at bottom, that's bogus.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I feel like part of our responsibility is also to say, great, this is important and the paymasters will love it. But on the other hand, there's also, I think, a kind of depressing, as a non-economist but lover of economics, a kind of lowering of ambition here that should also be, I think, set at some level. Now, I've said it in terms of ambition, nobility, grandeur, but just like, it's not really science at some moment, it becomes merely engineering, right? So, let me put it like that.
Yeah, I sympathize incredibly with those same sentiments. Matt and I are sort of at the stage in our dissertation work where we have to think about, what kind of empirical work do we want to do? And one of the questions is, well, what kind of data can I get? And if I get those data, what can I identify? What natural experiment do I have in that data that I can produce something that the profession will think will be credible? But I also really like that point about lowered ambitions. There's a strong sense in which the policy evaluation of the quasi-experimental approach is an ex post kind of policy evaluation. We need the experiments to exist before we can do the policy evaluation, whereas the Cole's ambition was, we're going to do this ex ante.
That's a very nice way to put it.
This is fabulous.
Thank you.
I want to go back a little bit to to David Friedman's, the statistician, not the son of Milton.
Yeah.
Characterization of John Snow's research as statistics by shoe leather.
Right.
And if you sort of look at the sequence of natural experiments you talk about, you have Snow, then you have Jevons's Australian gold discovery, you have Friedman and Stigler's roofs and ceilings. Those are, at least 3 of them are enormously important statisticians.
Right.
And in those papers, they use really modest statistical methods. I don't think Stigler and Friedman actually used any statistical methods.
Right.
They just report what they found in the San Francisco Chronicle 1 ads.
Yes,
right?
yes.
That was it. And so that, I think that's where the transparency comes from.
Yeah.
There is nothing that an ordinary person can't grasp. And so in some ways that economics is not being imposed on people, economics is being found among people. And so this is really sort of a different sort of thinking about sort of idea. We're finding economics, and I'm not sure this speaks to the Heckman stuff, but there's a, so maybe in that context, you want to think about when Rutledge Vining defended National Bureau against Koopmans, he said, look, well, what the National Bureau is doing is they're doing hypothesis seeking. And Koopmans didn't have a terrific response to that. But so many years later, when Molenbeek looked back at that discussion, he thought, oh, that's what Vining is talking about is specification search. And he cites Lemur and he cites Tukey and all that sort of stuff. And so maybe one of the impositions from the standard Coles drill is they impose hypotheses on the world. And the National Bureau practice is discovering hypotheses as you go along. And this sort of, who's the master? Is it the ordinary people, or is it the expert? May actually be found in those ways. But I think the stuff you're talking about is just wonderfully interesting and terribly important.
Yeah, those are great points. Thank you.
So this is an important topic, so I'm glad to see it treated. So I've got some issues, first of all, just with your story about sort of the influence and how it developed in the economic imperialism part, and then this sort of victory lap notion, which I think may be a bit overstated. So one of the things in the economic imperialism, I think you may be missing some of the influence when you got to the health examples. I think there's a dimension of, Morawski was big on physics envy. I think there's an issue in economics now of sort of medical science treatment envy.
Yes.
In fact, one of the key phrases is treatment effects.
Or evidence-based policy, right?
But,
I mean,
but,
that
it's in
yeah.
particular this phrase treatment, and I think a lot of it comes from epidemiology and medicine.
Yes.
And having just recruited in health economics, there were all these papers where you couldn't really distinguish between the what was economics and what was basically simply epidemiology, and we're even sort of asking ourselves, where are these people, what departments are they from? But I think that influence is pretty important in terms of, and partly has to even to do with some of the money. So I think that it's not strictly economic imperialism. If anything, there's this influence the other way.
The natives aren't so hostile anymore.
I think it's already, mention was made of Heckman and so on. So I think there's already been some pushback in the profession, and there was that. Was it in? I can't remember if it was Journal of Economic Literature, but there was a Heckman, if anything, was in the middle. There was Angus Deaton had a very savage attack on the randomistas and so on.
Yes.
And one of the aspects that, and this is, I think, there's a little bit of an issue with transparency, is this issue that there's a black box dimension to this.
Yes.
That when you don't have the parameters, that you don't really understand why you're getting the result that you do. And this was also even in the Havelmo issue of why you don't want somebody who hasn't driven to be using this stuff. So I think that needs to be brought out a bit more, that there already has been this pushback in that dimension.
Yes.
And there was this issue of, there's already been this phraseology, one is internal versus external validity, which I think comes from elsewhere, of can you project beyond the thing. And then finally on the sort of lamppost issue, I think this concern has been raised, and I've heard Pischke talk about this, trying to defend it against the lamppost issue, but I think there's this general concern in economics that people are picking research questions. I mean, it's even called the sort of research question bias. You pick a research question if you can establish the causality, not because it's an important research question.
I know.
I guess. Oh, and the other thing you didn't mention is, does this new book have the bare-breasted Pischke and Angress? Because that's what you find in mostly harmless econometrics, all these muscle man pictures.
Well, the new one has this theme of kung fu throughout. I guess they were big fans of the TV show. It's very bizarre. But we do underemphasize sort of the controversy. Certainly leading up to Angress and Pischke's, as I called it, victory lap, which may not be a totally fair characterization, there was a lot of pushback already. Heckman certainly. I think more recently you've actually seen a lot of convergence between, in what sense you may characterize them as camps, but I think a lot of sort of a lot of work by sort of the John Bates Clark Award level people are starting to use these quasi-experimental methods to achieve structural ambitions. So they're asking, well, what can I identify, and then what does identify, with what I can identify, what does that tell me about the economic primitives? So I think there is some recent convergence, but it's hard to say how general or how this, but you're right, those are great points. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, John. Well, with Scott, we have the advantage that we had read already a preliminary version, so that's not fair. Basically, and this presentation links very well with the format that reminded us of the importance of new political economy in the public debate. And here you have a new generation of econometricians Joshua Angris, Guido Imbens, and all that, and how they are influencing economics in many ways, and the academic sphere. And this is my point. When you mentioned that the Five Furios, the book by Angris, was presented at Duke, not at the economics department, but somewhere else. And this is my question. I mean, you can see there is an increasing growth and influence of public policy department, not only in America, but around the world.
Right.
And these guys, actually, they are pointing out to that audience. And I think that's a very interesting phenomenon, because at the end of the day, in the 21st century, what they are trying to do, they are not attached to the mainstream.
Right.
I mean, they are mainstream in many ways.
But they have a lot of other perspectives that are coming in there.
And I don't know whether, I mean, because that could be another area of research, but what's going on with this public policy department who are attracting economists who are attached to applied economics and public policy issues, and philosophers, political scientists, which is a very interesting phenomenon. I don't know what's going to happen in the future with economics as the old department we are used to talk about.
Well, then there's business schools, which are a whole other animal. Yeah. No, I see the same thing. Yeah, I appreciate that.
I just wanted to make a small point about economic imperialism. I've published on this. I'm invested, but it's the phrase, I think, actually gets invented by Parsons in the 20s and 30s.
Okay.
And I'm pretty sure Stigler knows this. So there's a prehistory to the phrase, and it's really a debate between sociology and economics in that context.
Okay.
And the reception of Marshall's ideas, etc.
I didn't realize that.
I was interested in the interdisciplinary piece of this too, and the comparison you make at the end to the Stiglerian, imperialism. Is it your sense as an insider that there is the same sort of sneering? I mean, is there the sense that these methods make economics superior, or that the methods themselves are superior in ways that transcend disciplinarity?
So I don't know if you've seen, so Mariam Foucault, the Berkeley sociologist, had a paper that came out, I think just in January, and it's called The Superiority of Economists. It's a fabulous paper. But yes, I think there's a sense in economics that, yeah, we may ask some of the same questions that sociologists, epidemiologists, political scientists ask, but we do it better, right? We get the causality right. They're not doing it the right way. I think that's there.
I've
Yeah.
predicted that they're going to be displaced by the people who know how to do data mining. There's no reason to think economists ultimately will be better at that. So I think what you're describing, what the last question is, a whole hint to that. As you take economic theory out, you start losing your comparative advantage. Now you're still recruiting people with higher GRE scores. Right, so they have but when you compare to what physics and computer science and philosophy, then that evens out. So I think really, if this is the future for economics, it will actually evaporate.
Yeah.
I'm warning you.
Get out now.
Yes, it's fascinating paper. This morning I did one. So I have two just off the cuff comments in response. One is this on imperialism. There was a conference at the Asian Development Bank, I think around maybe 98, 2000 or something, and some of the luminaries were there. Barrow was there, and he was asked, there's been this tremendous amount of work in sociology and political science and so on. How come you're ignoring all of that? Because you're talking of development.
Oh yeah.
And of course, Asian Development Bank is the Japanese sphere of influence. So the very important Japanese sociologists, Korean political scientists and so on, who were dining directly with the president of that bank and so on. And Barrow's flip answer, half serious, maybe more than half serious, was, yes, when they have learned econometrics, I shall talk to them. So it's directly, it's that they are, so that's one point. Second point is what you are talking about, these policies, this is Leon's point, about these policy institutes. Over the last 4 or 5 years, I am just with great amusement watching this transformation take place at Hopkins. And our new president is a lawyer from Penn, the provost, former, and who loves this these social policy institutes
Oh, yeah.
and so on and so on. And then the chair of the department, of the economics department, was Robert Moffat, who was one of
Yes.
the characters of your story.
Yes.
And editor of AER, before that editor of the Review of Economics and Statistics, so there's a mainstream. And in the beginning, Moffat was loving all of this because it's like suddenly everything is coming to its right place. And as he told me some years back, he said, well, things are going to change around here. And now I don't see that enthusiasm because the changes are such that economics is being truncated considerably at every level.
Yeah.
And in fact, the last thing, and it's a very fitting, almost Grecian thing to the thing, we were gradually asked 2 months ago that we have better quarters for you outside the campus in the hospital. Again, the public health and the Wyman Park and so on. I at once inquired, is there asylum there also? That is very, very interesting. So what you are seeing is just happening in a very natural, and of course Hopkins Public School,
Yes.
School of Medicine, all
Right.
of that. Thank you.
So thank you, John. It was really interesting. Evidence-based policy is a very big issue in Germany, actually. The last
Right.
The last German Economic Association meeting was exclusively dedicated to it. So, but when I hear all that, and I learned a lot from the presentation and also from the discussion, I really have to think of the methodical debates of the late 19th century. You know, Austrian school and historical school, and all these issues of relativity in time and space, and research selection bias, proximity to policy makers, and all that. So how would you comment on that? Might that be an interesting footnote to the story? And more specifically, how does this type of research deal with relativity and time and space? So why should I learn something about minimum wages between Pennsylvania and New Jersey when it comes to the new minimum wage in Germany?
Yeah, I think your last comment sort of gets at some of this external validity, right? The economists are economic experts, but the kind of expertise they have is a very specialized expertise. It's an expertise about if you're a critic of it, right, they're experts about, in some sense, trivial or isolated kinds of situations. But I think your first point, a lot of these themes sort of emerge and reemerge throughout 20th century economics, and as you said, even before that. So the MBER, Cole's debates, the Keynes Tinbergen debate, have these same sorts of themes between empiricism and rationalism is probably not the right word, but theory, yes, going back and forth. So I think it's something I think the paper could probably benefit in, is sort of situating it in that kind of context, is economics navigating those junctures. Yeah, thank you.
So earlier this year, I interviewed a candidate for an analyst position who was getting his undergraduate at Princeton in economics, and he was running a regression on the 2008 recession with 4 instrumental variables.
Nice.
So my question to you and to the room is, at what point do we expect completely separate disciplines between econometrics and actual economics, particularly when those kinds of technical skills don't require the level of intuition that economics might require? And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, or what it means for those of us that aren't as specialized in econometrics. The second thing that I've noticed in reading other people's works in progress with econometrics is a tendency to skip the ocular regression, which is they don't plot it on paper before they see what's going to happen, and you get an assumption about a functional form that is nothing like what the picture looks like, and it's never checked. And I'm wondering, to what extent do these experimental approaches consciously take the time to question the functional forms that they're applying to the data?
So what you've just said is a key point that critics of the quasi-experimental program are latching onto. Angerst and Pischke push very hard, and we shouldn't single out them, there are others. They push very hard that the linear functional form is an excellent first approximation of any sort of functional form you want. So to a first order, your estimates are going to be what you want them to be.
So diminishing marginal returns are completely out the window.
To a first order, yeah. And they push this very hard, and this is something certainly critics. I would point to Michael Conn, who's not a fan, and his criticisms. What Conn really points out is that the linear functional form is an assumption. So to the degree that these methods are sold as sort of assumption-free or an empiricism is overstated, because at the end of the day, you have an additively separable error term and a linear regression. So that criticism is out there, and it's something, it's not brought out here, but yeah, I think you've latched onto that point.
I think that brings us to the end of our time, so thank you very much, John.
Thank you.